The renowned philosopher Aristotle once referred to women as, quote, deformed males who were, quote, unable to control themselves physically and psychologically through the exercise of reason the way that men can. Aristotle believed too much education and sports activity made a woman infertile. Who knew one of the alleged greatest philosophers in world history was actually just another toxic podcast bro who never got over his 7th grade crush rejecting him? But while Aristotle was busy cementing himself as the father of misogyny, something far more important was happening. A woman named Sensica was competing in the Olympic Games and on her way to becoming the Olympics' first female champion as a 4-horse chariot racer. But a lot of men during Sensica's time thought just like Aristotle, just to crystallize that women have been fighting for respect, agency, and equality in athletic spaces since literally before that fellow Jesus Christ was born. Things, of course, have gotten better, though yesterday's Aristotle is apparently today's presidential candidate.
Crooked Joe Biden became mentally impaired, sad. But lying Kamala Harris, honestly, I believe she was born that way. There's something wrong with Kamala. And I just don't know what it is, but there is definitely something missing. And you know what? Everybody knows it.
But as we edge closer to possibly electing the first female president, who also would be the first Black woman and Asian to hold that particular office, we sit at a particularly interesting moment that weaves together what we're seeing in politics with what we're seeing in women's sports. Currently, women's sports are experiencing a revolution that is led in large part by the staggering explosion in women's basketball. Last college basketball season, the women's national championship game outrated the men's national championship game for the first time in history, not by a little, but by a lot. An average of 18.7 million viewers watched the South Carolina women remain undefeated against Caitlin Clark's Iowa team, with the game peaking at 24 million viewers. Meanwhile, the men averaged 14.8 million viewers. Hey fellas, get your viewers up. Despite the naysayers that predicted that momentum wouldn't translate to the WNBA went on to experience its most watched regular season ever, led by WNBA Rookie of the Year, Caitlin Clark, and another heralded rookie, Angel Reese. 22 regular season WNBA games averaged more than 1 million viewers. In-person attendance was up 48%. And every single WNBA team posted year-over-year growth in attendance. Beyond basketball, Simone Biles added 3 more gold medals to her stellar resume at the Paris Olympics this past summer. Overall, female athletes competing in the Olympics brought home 67 of this country's 126 medals, including 26 of Team USA's gold medals. The National Women's Soccer League has already surpassed 1.5 million in attendance and is expected to reach 2 million by the end of the season. Erin Haynes, the editor-at-large for The 19th, an independent nonprofit news organization that focuses on gender, politics, and policy, believes any conversation about the explosion of women's sports should immediately be followed with one about women in this year's national election.
I really think that the trajectory of women's sports parallels the rise of women's leadership generally in this country in a way that is undeniable.
It might be obvious to some, but others still refuse to acknowledge there is a deep connection between women's continued fight for agency in the sports space with women's continued fight for their basic rights overall. And the excuses for looking away is dwindling. The stakes are high for women in this election. We are now living in a post-Roe versus Wade world. In 2022, the Supreme Court ended a woman's constitutional right to abortion, a right that had been protected since 1973. The year before abortion was ruled to be constitutionally protected, there was another major piece of legislation that would be an important cornerstone for women in sport. In 1972, Title IX became public law. That signature legislation prohibited sex-based discrimination in any education programs or activities that received federal funding. It mandated that schools and universities had to provide equal opportunities for both genders in sports. But despite the Supreme Court's decision on Roe versus Wade and Title IX being seemingly entrenched into law, equal opportunities and reproductive rights are still very much on the ballot for the upcoming election. Project 2025, created by the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, or as I like to think of them, Hell Hydra from the Marvel movies, they developed a conservative playbook that will guide Donald Trump if he gets another presidential term. Project 2025 is over 900 pages, and let's just keep it a stack. Nobody reading all that. Something they were definitely counting on, because if people read it, it would effectively scare the shit out of them. So let me do some of the hard work for you. Pull up a chair, and I'll tell you about how a second Trump term would result in infinitely less rights and empowerment for women. Here are some of the important cliff notes. Project 2025 seeks to end medication abortion, meaning women would no longer have access to abortion pills. It would also deny access to abortion care in emergency situations. Increase pregnancy and abortion surveillance at the federal level, which means hospitals and doctors would be required to report not just abortions, but miscarriages and stillbirths. And if you don't report it, then you could be denied federal funding. By the way, all of you women who use period trackers might want to delete that app to be on the safe side. In the workplace, Project 2025 would rescind an important executive order by former President Lyndon B. Johnson that prohibited federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race and sex, which ultimately led to the creation of Title IX. They also want to get rid of the Department of Labor Women's Bureau and weaken the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So if women face discrimination in educational institutions or in federal workplaces, they would have to spend a shit ton of money to file a lawsuit, and that would ultimately be time-consuming and defeating. Project 2025 also wants to redefine sexual health education as pornography and replace it with abstinence-only education. Now, if there's one thing we can count on, it is for teenagers to be abstinent. And speaking of pornography, the Project 2025 agenda includes an outright ban on porn, including criminalizing it. I bet these Project 2025 people are an absolute fucking blast at parties. So to recap, they're coming for your reproductive rights, your contraception, your right to fight against abuses and discrimination, your porn, and it seems like, and not to be too dramatic, your general right to exist without being harmed. Now, given everything that is at stake, the big question is, will women rise to the challenge in this election and send a strong message that they ain't trying to live out some new season of The Handmaid's Tale? Let's not forget the important role women have played in the last two presidential elections, for better or for worse. In 2020, female athletes in the WNBA sent a clear message about what they not gonna do, and that is support a politician who got them all the way fucked up.
Well, let's start off with calls for U.S. Senator Kelly Loeffler to step away from the Atlanta Dream, the WNBA team that she co-owns. She recently wrote a letter to the WNBA commissioner, and according to NBC News, Loeffler was explaining her opposition to players wearing Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name slogans on warm-up jerseys. She writes in the letter about the need to take politics out of sports, saying sports have the power to be a unifying antidote. She says she does not support what she calls the Black Lives Matter political movement, saying it wants to defund the police, remove Jesus from churches, and promotes violence and destruction across the country. Now, this has not gone over well with many current and former WNBA players. The Players Union responding today on Twitter, simply saying enough OUT.
If fuck around and find out was a person, because Kelly Loeffler found out you don't want no smoke with the women in the WNBA. The Atlanta Dream and other WNBA players threw their support behind Loeffler's challenger in the Senate race, Reverend Raphael Warnock, after initially polling at 9%, became Georgia's first Black senator, thanks to the popularity boost he received from the widespread support from the W. Eventually, as senator, Warnock casted a vote to confirm Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson as the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, allowing Joe Biden to fulfill his campaign promise to put a Black woman in that seat. But let's have an honesty moment. We know Black women are going to show up in this election and show up in force, as they have in the previous elections. In 2016, 91% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton. In 2020, 92% of Black women voted for Joe Biden. Meanwhile, with reproductive rights on the table and Donald Trump bragging about grabbing women by the hoo-ha, 54% of white women voted for Trump in 2016. And in 2020, the number of white women who voted for Trump was even higher at 55%. 5%. Here's Aaron Haynes again on what the white women gonna do in this election. Will they finally reject the man who has been found credibly liable of committing rape by a court of law and who loves to brag about taking away their reproductive rights? Or will white women again be the ops?
That is a perennial question every 4 years, right? Because I think, whether we're calling them suburban moms or lipstick moms or whatever, whoever we want to, whatever nickname we want to give them every 4 years, like that's who we're talking about. We're talking about white women who, frankly, have, in our modern politics, have tended to vote majority Republican, right? So we're talking about, we probably are not talking about majority. Well, who knows? Let me not make that prediction. We don't know if white women are going to finally come over to, the Democratic Party and vote in the majority, but will there be some greater number of white women that decide to do that this year because they literally feel like they have skin in the game, especially around the issue of rights and freedom, reproductive rights, abortion access in particular, right? I think that, what we have seen since the Dobbs decision in 2022 is that white women are starting to say, hey, maybe I do need to think about how this is affecting me, right? Maybe they didn't care about their Black and brown sisters, prior to 2022, but they're now understanding that, hey, wait, we do actually have a shared fate and our shared gender might actually be the thing that I need to think about and not just my race and tying myself to whiteness.
There is still so much that women need to fight for, even as we celebrate and acknowledge some of the historic gains that have happened, particularly in the last year. But the choice is really simple for women in this election. What's a better direction for women, moving forward or going back? I'm Jemele Hill, and I approve this message.